As NASA prepares for next week's launch of the first human spaceflight around the moon since 1972, the agency has laid out its plan for a new lunar base, nuclear reactors in space, science missions, and continued presence in low Earth orbit. For the 150th time, we've got all that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. With less than a week to go until the launch of NASA's Artemis II mission to the moon, the agency hosted a day-long event at its headquarters in Washington, D.C. called Ignition, where it laid out its plans for the next decade of exploration and science. But before all of that, first things first. How is Artemis II doing? Well, the SLS rocket and Orion spacecraft for that mission are now out on the pad, and work is underway to prepare them for the launch. The mobile launcher has been secured and connected to the pad ground systems. The pad emergency egress system baskets have been installed on the mobile launcher. The engine access platforms have been removed from the base of the rocket, and the rocket and spacecraft communication systems are being tested ahead of launch, which is still scheduled for no earlier than April 1st. The crew, which began quarantine last week, arrived at the Kennedy Space Center this Friday.
I asked this same question to the crew of Polaris Dawn when they launched about a year and a half ago now, and I figured given the weight of what could be happening next week, I figured I'd toss it your guys' way too. Given the weight of what could be happening next week, how do you think this mission is going to affect you both personally and professionally?
That is a deep question, and thanks for posing it. And it's interesting to have a Polaris Dawn crew member here as well. It underscores some things that are being said all the time, the golden age of space exploration. There's so many amazing things happening, and we should be proud, all of us. I'm not going to answer your question. I actually spend a lot of time keeping myself from thinking beyond the mission on purpose when I start to daydream about those things, just because I really want to focus and give my all to this task. All astronauts start a mission with one goal: to not mess it up. And I think that is really at the core of it. We have a lot of work to do. And so, but I will share something that is related to what you asked. I can tell you this: my first mission, the dream of going to space, because it was my first time, was there. It was front and center, even if I tried to focus past it or beyond it. This mission is much more about duty and responsibility, so we can pass the batons off for this campaign called Artemis with its lofty goals. We live that every day, and then that's it. And then we want to back out and disappear while the Artemis III crew stands in front of this microphone. And so I personally really look forward to that period where I think personally and professionally it is going to satisfy all of this risk chasing that I've been doing for 27 years.
Here at NSF, we'll be all in when it comes to covering this mission. Ahead of launch, we've already started with our regular countdown to launch streams discussing the latest updates. On launch day, we'll have a stakeout stream early in the day, and closer to launch, a dedicated launch stream going through the last few hours of the countdown and through the initial phase of the mission. Once the mission is underway, we'll also have special mission coverage live as it happens, and through episodes just like this of This Week in Spaceflight. The entire mission is set to last 10 days, so hopefully, if all goes well, 2 episodes of This Week in Spaceflight from now, we'll be able to talk about the return of Artemis II back to Earth after an amazing flight around the moon and back. But what happens after Artemis II? Well, that is in fact exactly what was talked about at NASA's Ignition event this past Tuesday. The event included dedicated presentations from Lori Glaze, Acting Associate Administrator for Exploration Systems Development Mission Directorate, Carlos Garcia Galan, Moon Base Program Executive, Dana Weigel, LEO Program Manager, Nikki Fox, Associate Administrator for the Science Mission Directorate, and Steve Sinecor, Space Reactors Office Program Executive. During Glaze's presentation, she talked about what's coming up during Artemis missions 3, 4, and 5. As NASA announced last month, Artemis III is no longer going to be a lunar landing mission and will instead demonstrate the new spacesuits, the lander systems of either Blue Moon, Starship, or both, along with Orion while in the safety of Earth orbit. This would take place in the middle of 2027, and it wouldn't be until Artemis IV in early 2028 that the first lunar landing would take place. A second lunar landing would then occur during Artemis V in late 2028. NASA confirmed during the Ignition event that the agency intends to standardize SLS's configuration by procuring ULA's Centaur 5 upper stage. Lori Glaze explained that right now, the agency is still deciding whether this would occur on Artemis 4 or 5, which will also depend on whether they'll use the third and final interim cryogenic propulsion stage on Artemis 3 or on Artemis 4. What we didn't get were any major updates on the status of the landers. Lori did confirm that there could possibly be changes to the early Artemis missions to allow an easier introduction of the landers into the program and to get to the lunar surface earlier than otherwise. Beyond Artemis V, NASA wants to transition to a purely commercial system to send crews from Earth to lunar orbit. That's where they would then take a ride down to the surface on the commercially developed and reusable Human Landing System landers. These missions would take place in a regular 6-month cadence, similar to crew rotation missions to the International Space Station. To that end, the agency has already sent out a request for information to companies to see who might be interested in providing these services. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that SLS and Orion are out of the picture, as the companies in charge of their development and production could try on their own to sell them to NASA commercially. But being realistic, it's not clear that they could be turned into commercially viable products for this purpose. But why go to the lunar surface so often in that 6-month cadence? Well, that's where NASA's moon base comes into play. It's not the first time that there's been a proposal by NASA for a lunar base. It's not even the first time under this program. A handful of years ago, NASA already projected what it called the Artemis Base Camp, but the actual plans to set up this base were not fully clear. They consisted of missions spaced out by a year or more, and were very limited in what they could carry out on the lunar surface. Plus, on top of that, NASA was also developing the Lunar Gateway Station that would be in lunar orbit. Under the present administration, this is now changed. The focus is now fully on a base on the lunar surface, and because of that, the agency has paused the Gateway program and is putting all resources on the base. The base would be built up in 3 phases. An early one dedicated to learning and experimenting the technologies needed for building the base, which would run until 2028. A second one running from 2028 to 2032 that would set up early habitation capabilities and demonstrate logistics to and from the base. And a third phase starting in 2032 that would work towards a sustained human presence on the lunar surface. Each phase would see increasingly more complex missions and a higher cadence too. Early on during phase 1, the key players will be the robotic landers under NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services, or CLPS program. The aim would be to dramatically increase the cadence of these missions from 2 or 3 a year to up to 10 a year by 2028. These missions would also deliver hardware for the first human landings, such as the lunar terrain vehicles to be used in those missions, and moonfall drones to explore the lunar surface independently. These drones would be a new addition to the program and will be under the management of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Phase 1 would also involve 1 or more communication satellite systems around the moon, which are missions that have already been underway for a while, and it would also finally see the delivery of the Viper rover to the lunar surface. Some other technology demonstrations that NASA is considering for Phase 1 would include the use of radioisotope heater units, which would provide enough heat to allow hardware on the moon to survive the 2 weeks of cold lunar night. Each one of these aspects of Phase 1 would then evolve during Phase 2, with larger CLPS landers, more infrastructure placed on the lunar surface, and more complex hardware. For example, the early crewed rovers would be unpressurized, and NASA is also splitting the development of these into an early phase where they'd be much simpler than the original requirements, and later phases where more requirements are added into the rover design as the program evolves. As part of Phase 2, JAXA, the Japanese space agency, would send its pressurized rover that's being developed in partnership with NASA to the lunar base. This would work as a sort of mobile habitat that would allow crews to traverse the lunar surface without wearing bulky EVA suits. This phase would also test out technology demonstrations such as nuclear surface power capabilities, surface communications, and an augmentation of the existing solar power structure. There'd be demonstrations of in-situ resource utilization, excavation and compaction, initial habitation and logistics capabilities, and much more. These efforts would then culminate in Phase 3, where larger landers would deliver permanent habitats. There'd be a regular cadence of supply missions to the base, more lunar rovers, and there'd even be the return of cargo from the base back to Earth, independent from the return of the crew, similar to the return of cargo from the International Space Station separate from the crew. Now, all of this won't be cheap, as NASA expects that each phase may cost about $10 billion each. Early on, the agency hopes to pull resources from existing budgets, and with programs like Gateway now paused, that would free up even more resources. It's also likely that in the longer term, NASA is betting that freeing up budget from SLS and Orion could also pay for some of this in the later phases of the base. It's also quite a daunting task, especially when it comes to ramping up the cadence so quickly, given that so many of the robotic landers are still very early in their development. It's definitely going to take some heavy work to accomplish all of this, but it's clear that there's an intention to do more than has ever been done in the last several decades when it comes to lunar exploration. Now, there's something else that NASA is hoping to do more often, and that's using nuclear power in space. I just said a minute ago that it's part of the plans for the lunar base. NASA has tried many times in the past to revive the use of nuclear fission reactors, either on spacecraft or on the lunar surface. There have been rather successful subscale demonstrations, and many different flagship programs have started and then been canceled, but nothing's ever been flown. Here's where the Space Reactor 1 Freedom comes into play. SR-1 is a brand new spacecraft that would be built using Gateway's power and propulsion element, also known as PPE, as its satellite bus, and would feature an experimental 20-kilowatt nuclear fission reactor to power the electric thrusters on PPE. This spacecraft would be launched no earlier than December 2028 on a trajectory to Mars to deliver the Skyfall payload. Skyfall would consist of 3 Ingenuity-class helicopters that would be used to scout potential future human landing sites and map subsurface water ice on Mars. The whole purpose of the spacecraft is not to deliver Skyfall, but rather to test the use of a nuclear fission reactor to power a spacecraft in space, and this would actually happen pretty quickly after launch, as NASA expects it to be started just 48 hours after liftoff. Skyfall just happens to be a bonus mission that could be carried out thanks to this. According to Steve Sinecor, the teams at NASA haven't decided yet whether SR-1 would perform a Mars orbit insertion burn, or whether it would just be a flyby that would drop Skyfall and then continue on. If it were the latter, it could be interesting to see where SR-1 might go afterwards. The testing of this space reactor would allow NASA to move towards a lunar reactor to be launched in 2030 based on the data from SR-1. After that, the idea would be to scale this technology up to more powerful reactors that could eventually also be used on human missions to Mars. The big question is whether all of this will be able to come to fruition within the very aggressive timelines that they've set for themselves. As always, only time will tell. If you want to follow along, tune into future episodes and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss it. And if you like our space news coverage, give us a like too. Now, how could NASA possibly follow up a nuclear mission to Mars? Well, with some cutting-edge science, of course. The agency announced that it wants to set a new standard on how to execute science missions, taking inspiration from the upcoming Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope. With its wide field of view, the observatory will study large swaths of the universe at once in great detail, trying to answer some of the most pressing questions about dark energy, exoplanets, and the history of our universe. The telescope recently completed construction and is now undergoing testing. The agency plans to show it off to the public next month. And what's extra special is that it's under budget and ahead of schedule. That doesn't happen very often in spaceflight, so clearly NASA wants to replicate that success. They outlined some plans on how to achieve that with future missions, building on the successes of current and past missions. This includes squeezing much more out of launch opportunities with ride shares, finding ways to use low-cost instruments, and flying scientific payloads on commercial platforms. But these new ambitions might also change how NASA handles some of its older missions. The agency has previously attempted to keep operating missions for as long as the spacecraft was somewhat functional, but that might change soon.
It is very clear that we cannot continue to spend hundreds of millions of dollars for legacy extended science missions that particularly on their operations, as their scientific value starts to diminish.
Now, the big question is, who gets to decide whether a mission is no longer worth it? Let's look at NASA's Chandra mission, for example. A few years ago, Congress tried to cut funding as the telescope had slowly degraded over the years and the cost had increased. But the scientific community quickly pushed back as there was no replacement, and this asset couldn't be let go. Chandra may be old, but it's still the best that we have. Of course, at some point, a mission will become so expensive that it may no longer be worth pouring money into. We're just hoping that NASA won't hurt science by making that call too early. Beyond changing operations, the agency also wants to continue its legacy by introducing new missions.
Many of the technologies that have the most promise for health and safety of America can only be derived from work done in space, and we cannot afford to fall behind or cede leadership. We must evolve how we explore. We need to move faster, we must look further, and we must do it first.
So with that in mind, NASA is now looking for ideas and collaborations to make it happen. The agency has issued calls for proposals to put more science on future missions to the Moon and Mars. Mentioning the recently announced and privately funded Eric and Wendy Schmidt Observatory System, NASA is now looking for partnerships for bigger missions. None of these missions are possible within the current budget, but maybe with some help? The first category is planetary defense, which studies asteroids and comets on short notice to figure out if they pose a threat to our planet. And if they do, well, we need a mission to put it on a different path to protect our home. Blue Origin recently announced some planetary defense concepts that might line up very well with this. From asteroids getting too close to Earth, the next concept looks far out beyond the solar system. NASA's Voyager probes are now traveling through interstellar space, and it would be great to get some newer instruments out that way. That would require a spacecraft to travel extremely fast, but with the right partners, it could be feasible. Finally, NASA has set its eyes on Uranus following the recommendations of the 2023 Planetary Science and Astrobiology Decadal Survey. This distant ice giant is the closest analog that we have in the solar system to many exoplanets. Studying Uranus would help scientists better understand these worlds, as well as the history of our own neighborhood. It would be a big mission that NASA would usually tackle on its own or in collaboration with one of its international partners, but this time it seems the agency is open to joining forces with anyone willing to fund it, commercial, private, or even philanthropic. Now, all of these ideas are great, but they're still just ideas for now. Calls for proposals, interest, and collaboration. NASA is still willing to do science, but they're also clearly trying to find workarounds for an administration that isn't too keen on spending money on it. Trying to make science cheaper is great because that would, at least in theory, allow for the ability to do more science. But that also only works if there's an intention to do more science. The slides may have said science as only NASA can, but without money, we can't be sure that they will. But if someone, the government, or anyone else really, provides the funding, they might. Wait, that's a beautiful picture. Have we seen that before? No! If that all wasn't enough, as part of the Ignition event, the agency also released this brand new shot of our solar system's most striking planet. Hubble and the James Webb Space Telescope collaborated to show two new perspectives, one in visible light and one in infrared. The images show incredible detail in the planet's atmosphere, revealing what's going on at different altitudes. So it's not just pretty, but useful too. Aren't science missions great? With all these plans for settling on the moon and deploying robots throughout the solar system, you might start thinking that NASA has lost interest in low Earth orbit. But you'd be wrong. The agency has, of course, had a continuous presence in LEO for over 25 years through the International Space Station. While we all love the orbital outpost, it is nearing the end of its life. Current plans call for decommissioning of the aging station to begin in 2030, but Congress recently discussed the option to push that to 2032, fearing that a replacement might not be ready in time. It can't be pushed much beyond then, though, as NASA expects structural issues will start to become a problem by the mid-2030s. So what's the plan? Well, NASA hoped that the ISS could be succeeded by multiple commercial space stations. Various companies are indeed working on their own space stations, which we regularly cover on the show. They're making good progress, but might not be going fast enough, and NASA's budget to support these stations is limited. Very limited. Only $250 million per year. All in all, it seems increasingly more likely that NASA and its partners may just have to leave low Earth orbit for a while after the ISS is gone. Just last week, the European Space Agency announced that it's planning an ESA-led Crew Dragon flight to the ISS in the first quarter of 2028. This medium-duration mission would provide more flight opportunities for the agency's latest class of astronauts to actually go to the ISS before time's up. Cool mission, but it certainly doesn't radiate confidence that ESA astronauts will have anywhere to go after the ISS. And that's not even where the problems end. Remember that NASA wanted the ISS replacement to be a number of commercial stations and that NASA could be just one of many customers? They wanted a self-sustaining market, with the agency providing no more than half of the demand. Well, it now seems that there might not actually be a market to support that. After some analysis, NASA painted a pretty bleak picture this week. Although the ISS has hosted commercial payloads and experiments, seen commercial visitors and even space tourists knock on its door, NASA believes that the market is simply not big enough.
Though we have seen investor interest, there's no independently verifiable market research indicating the economic viability of a commercial station that is only partially funded by NASA.
Yeah, that's not good. So that's why NASA has proposed a new plan to transition away from the ISS in multiple phases. First, NASA wants to procure a core module as a starting point for a successor space station. This would connect to the ISS and add additional docking ports to enable more commercial visits, also known as private astronaut missions. The module should have all of the systems that a space station needs, from power and propulsion to life support, which will allow it to function as the backbone of a new space station. The module would then be expanded with 2 commercial space station modules, which are entirely owned, developed, and operated by commercial partners. Astronauts could then commission these modules using the facilities on the ISS and even transfer some ISS equipment to the new station. And then it'll detach and become its own independent station. The next phase will see NASA increase the power generation and cooling capabilities of the station with another module, which would allow for the addition of even more commercial add-ons. And from there on, it all depends on the market. If there's sufficient commercial demand, the station could split up, or perhaps even more independent stations could launch. Now, these plans might seem familiar. That was exactly what Axiom planned to do with its own station, but now NASA is taking the lead and allowing other companies to join in. So from multiple independent commercial stations, we go to a single station spearheaded by NASA. And this will certainly shake up the plans for some of the companies already working on commercial stations. For example, Starlab was supposed to be a fully functional station with half the internal volume of the ISS, all launching on a single Starship flight. Attaching that to NASA's new station seems a bit silly. But maybe they could redraw their plans and pitch it as the core module. On the other hand, Axiom Station, Vast's Haven 2, and the Blue Origin-led Orbital Reef are modular stations. So starting with attaching a single module to NASA's new station might not be such a bad idea. Either way, this is only one step that NASA wants to take to ignite a commercial space station industry. They're also changing the rules for the private astronaut missions to the ISS, starting with increasing the cadence to 2 missions per year. They'll also drop the requirement that the mission commander has ISS experience, enabling the sale of another seat. This has limited the commercial viability of Axiom's ISS missions, so they're probably glad to see the change. What's more, NASA might even buy a seat on one of those missions as well. While drastic, the changes to the program seem needed and more realistic, even though there still isn't enough money to make it all happen. But that is up to politics. All we can do now is hope that these plans will get funded and actually succeed in starting up that commercial space market that NASA has been dreaming of. And that's your recap of NASA's Ignition event. Except, okay, well, there is actually one more thing. Thus far, we've only talked about NASA's space ambitions, but there is, of course, the often forgotten aeronautics branch too. The first A in NASA, after all. And within this part, the agency works on projects like the X-59, a prototype for a quiet supersonic aircraft designed with special geometry to reduce sonic booms to a quiet thump. Just last week, it flew on its second flight, but had to return to the ground early following a vehicle system warning. It flew again this week and has planned dozens of additional test flights this year. Administrator Jared Isaacman, who is a known aviation enthusiast, assured us that he isn't ignoring this branch of NASA and also teased some aeronautics announcements for later this year. So I guess there's even more to come. Okay, so clearly that NASA Ignition event really dominated the news this week, but there's even more news in this video. We also got some stories about satellite constellations to share this week. Luxembourg-based satellite communications operator SES announced a new constellation called Meosphere, which, as the name suggests, will be operating in medium Earth orbit, or about 8,000 kilometers above our heads. Like so many other constellations these days, this satellite network focuses on data communications. Depending on the antenna, it can provide a link of up to 4 gigabits per second, and it's even compatible with the non-terrestrial variant of 5G. It's not just for data connections around the world, though, as the satellites will also be fitted with optical intersatellite links, allowing the transfer of up to 100 gigabits per second between satellites. This won't just connect the satellites together, but could also be tapped by space stations, orbital data centers, and other satellites. To build the network, the company contracted Californian satellite builder K2 Space, which got its start only a few years ago. They'll start out small, with only 28 satellites across 4 orbital planes, but because of its positioning in medium Earth orbit, it'll be enough to provide global coverage. They might even scale further based on market demand. Apart from SES, this week Amazon also announced its intention to ramp up the deployment of its Amazon LEO constellation. To start, next week we've got the 5th launch of these satellites via ULA's Atlas V rocket, and later in April another 2 missions will launch back-to-back on Atlas V and Ariane 6 rockets. The company has announced that it already has 6 satellite stacks ready to launch at its satellite processing facility in Florida, and it's producing 30 satellites per week, setting the stage to be able to launch even more of these satellites in the near future. Amazon confirmed that it has also bought 10 extra missions on SpaceX's Falcon 9 and turned launch options on Blue Origin's New Glenn into actual launch contracts. As part of this latest announcement, Amazon also released a render of what the payload stacks for each of the rockets look like. Through improvements on the RL-10 engine used on the Centaur stage of Atlas V, they've been able to increase the number of satellites from 27 to 29, which will become a regular thing starting with next week's launch. Launches on Vulcan and New Glenn will also substantially increase the number of LEO satellites launched on each mission, which should help them to quickly deploy more into orbit. It's very likely that this release may have been to publicly show Amazon's commitment to deploy its internet satellite constellation more quickly, especially since it recently requested that the FCC extend its deadline for launching half of its constellation and operating it. But if there's any company out there that loves to ramp up cadence and scale things up, it's SpaceX. Hundreds of launches and thousands of Starlink satellites later, the company is now proposing a 1 million satellite AI data center constellation in space. The project itself is not new. In fact, we even covered this in a previous episode. But among the many daunting things that SpaceX would need to do for this, like ramping up Starship's launch cadence, building more launch pads, and probably building more factories and propellant generation plants, there's also the matter of actually building the satellites themselves. That's where Terafab comes in. This week, SpaceX announced that it's teaming up with XAI, which it recently integrated as part of the company, and with Tesla to develop a semiconductor fabrication plant, which they're calling Terafab. According to the announcement this week, the plant would not only create the chips for the AI data centers, but it would also be dedicated to the packaging and shipping of the end products, whether for terrestrial data centers or space-based data centers. The announcement came with an early render of what SpaceX calls an AI mini-sat with a solar array span even longer than a full Starship stack. And that's the mini version. The goal would be to initially launch these on Starship at a large scale, but much later down the line, SpaceX envisions that these could be fabricated and launched from the moon using a mass drive system. But needless to say, there'll probably be a lot of This Week in Spaceflight episodes until we see anything like that happen. This is your weekly space traffic report provided by Next Spaceflight. This was a rather active week in launches, but also for scrubs. From SpaceX, we had 3 different Starlink launches this week, delivering another 79 Starlink satellites into orbit. But those weren't the only Starlink-like satellites that launched this week. A few days ago, Russia also launched a Soyuz rocket with 16 Rassvet 3 satellites on board. These are low Earth orbit internet satellites developed by Bureau 1440, a Russian company that's been working towards creating its own broadband satellite constellation like Starlink. Similar to Starlink, these satellites are flat-packed and stacked on top of each other, allowing for the ability to launch more of them in a compact fairing volume. That also wasn't the only Soyuz rocket that launched this week, as we also had one from Baikonur, launching the Progress MS-33 cargo spacecraft to the International Space Station. This was the first launch from Site 316 since the launch of Soyuz MS-28 in November of last year damaged a platform at the pad that's used to access the bottom of the rocket. After separation from Soyuz, one of the antennas used by Progress for its Kurs rendezvous system failed to deploy. This meant that 2 days later, Roscosmos cosmonaut Sergei Kudzverchkov had to carry out a manual docking of Progress to the station using the backup Toru, or telerobotically operated rendezvous system. From China, there were also 2 launches this week, with satellites for the Senti Space Global Navigation Satellite Constellation and 2 new SuperView Neo-Earth observation satellites. This week, we were also hoping to see some other launches that have now slipped into next week. This includes the launch of Rocket Lab's Daughter of the Stars mission, which had to be delayed due to bad weather in the launch area. The return to flight for Landspace's Juche 2E rocket was also delayed during the countdown, but a new target date is still unknown at this time. ESAR Aerospace's Spectrum rocket also attempted its second ever launch this week, but a boat in the range forced a hold in the count that led to a fuel temperature higher than was needed for launch. It's currently unknown when the next launch attempt might happen, but we may see them try again soon, and hopefully, this time, please, No more wayward boats in the range. We not only had launch delays from New Zealand, China, and Norway, but even Russia had a delay on the debut flight of its Soyuz 5 rocket, which has slipped to next week as well. SpaceX is also planning its own set of launches next week, with 3 Starlink missions set to take place, as well as the launch of the Transporter 16 rideshare mission from Vandenberg. As mentioned earlier in the episode, ULA's Atlas V is also scheduled to launch the next batch of operational Amazon LEO satellites next week, which should bring them up to a total of 241 LEO satellites launched into orbit. But the star of the show next week could be the launch of NASA's Artemis II mission, which has its first launch opportunity within a 2-hour launch window, opening no earlier than April 1st at 22:24 UTC, with daily windows available through April 6th. We always recommend that you go to nextspaceflight.com or download the Next Spaceflight app on your phone to stay up to date with the latest changes to the schedule. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Alicia Siegel for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.